If you had $50 million in the bank, most people would think the problem is solved. But the ultra-rich see it differently, because even with $50 million in cash, you still wouldn't use it to buy this house. Not because you can't afford it, but because cash is the weakest form of power. To the ultra-rich, cash is exposed, cash is inefficient, cash is replaceable, control is not. That's why the wealthiest families on earth never buy homes the way everyone else does. They structure the deal, they leverage assets, they let institutions compete for the privilege of funding their lifestyle. So while the house looks expensive, it's someone else's money paying for it. And once you understand how this works, you'll never look at luxury real estate the same way again. This isn't about mansions, and it isn't about showing off wealth. It's about how power actually works at the highest level of money. When most people buy a home, they ask one question: how much does it cost? The ultra-rich ask something completely different. How do we structure this so our capital stays untouched? Because in their world, money is never meant to sit still. It's meant to attract cheaper money. Private banks don't see luxury homes as liabilities. They see them as tools. Tools for leverage, tools for control, tools for long-term dominance. In this video, you'll see how the ultra-rich buy extraordinary homes without using their own money, by structuring deals that protect their wealth, multiply their influence, and keep their capital working elsewhere. This is how luxury real estate really works, behind closed doors. At the highest levels of wealth, cash is not protection, it's exposure. Cash sits in plain sight, it waits, it does nothing, and the moment it's spent, it disappears. For most people, that disappearance feels comforting. No debt, no interest. No obligations, but comfort is not the objective of the ultra-rich. Control is. Control over timing, control over structure, control over outcomes that unfold years into the future. Cash removes that control the moment it leaves the account. At this altitude of wealth, money is not a tool for buying things. It's a tool for shaping environments. So when the ultra-rich look at a luxury home, they don't see marble or glass. They see a choice, a silent fork in the road: spend cash or preserve leverage. Most people spend, the ultra-rich preserve, because paying cash collapses flexibility into finality. Millions are converted into architecture, walls, floors. Land beautiful but immobile, and immobility has a hidden cost. While that money is frozen, markets shift, industries transform, businesses reprice, distress quietly appears and vanishes. The ultra-rich want their capital alive when that moment arrives. They want liquidity without compromise. So instead of spending cash, they let it breathe elsewhere. It compounds. It attracts cheaper capital. It opens doors that remain closed to everyone else. This is why outright ownership is rarely the goal. Ownership creates satisfaction. Control creates dominance. When you control an asset, you can refinance it. You can restructure it. You can reposition it. You can exit it without urgency. When you own it outright, you lose those options. All that remains is possession. Private banks understand this instinctively. They don't lend because the house is impressive. They lend because the borrower's wealth exists far beyond the house. Operating companies, equity portfolios, private funds, predictable cash flows, assets that keep producing even while the owner sleeps inside the home. So the house is never the purchase. It's a position, collateral inside a broader balance sheet, a strategic anchor within a much larger financial system. At this level, debt is not avoided. It's curated, used as insulation, used as leverage, used as distance between personal wealth and personal risk. Because when risk is structured correctly, it stops feeling dangerous. It starts feeling inevitable. And that is why cash, no matter how abundant, is rarely spent at the very top. So if cash is treated as exposure, what replaces it at the highest level of wealth? So if cash is treated as exposure, what replaces it? The answer isn't a product, It's a relationship, private banking, not the kind with branches, brochures, and waiting lines, but the kind that operates quietly, by invitation only, behind closed doors. At this level, banks don't advertise. They observe, they watch balance sheets, they study cash flows, they track behavior over time, and when they engage, it's not to sell a loan, it's to design a structure. Because the ultra-rich never walk into a bank asking, "Can I afford this house?" They arrive knowing they can. What they ask instead is something far more important. How do we structure this so my capital remains untouched? That single question changes the entire conversation. Now the bank is no longer an authority, it's a collaborator. The discussion shifts away from approval and toward terms, timelines, interest, collateral, flexibility. Private banks compete fiercely for these clients. Not because they need deposits, but because lending to strength is the safest business model in the world. The borrower already controls assets that dwarf the value of the home, operating companies, public equities, private funds, predictable income streams, assets that continue producing regardless of market noise. So the home itself becomes secondary, often symbolic, just one visible piece backed by layers of invisible collateral. Stocks can be pledged without being sold. Businesses can support credit lines without changing ownership. Entire portfolios can be quietly secured without ever touching the principal. Instead of liquidating assets to buy a home, the ultra-rich borrow against them. Their investments stay intact. They keep compounding. They keep producing. They keep positioning the owner for the next opportunity. Meanwhile, the bank provides liquidity at a fraction of the cost, low interest, flexible repayment, long horizons, because the bank isn't betting on the property, it's betting on the ecosystem surrounding the borrower. This is why enormous loans at the top feel calm, almost casual. There is no stress, no urgency, no fear of margin calls triggered by lifestyle purchases, because these borrowers are never over-leveraged, they are over-collateralized. And that difference is everything. To the outside world, it looks like debt. Inside the structure, it's insulation, distance between personal wealth and personal risk. If markets pull back, they wait. If opportunities appear, liquidity is already available. And if the home appreciates in value, the leverage quietly improves the entire position. At this level, borrowing is not about need. It's about positioning, borrowing from strength. Borrowing to preserve control, borrowing so capital never has to stand still. This is what replaces cash, not spending structuring, not ownership control, and not visibility silence. But leverage alone isn't the secret. The real advantage comes from how risk disappears entirely. From the outside, leverage looks dangerous. Borrowing money, using debt, depending on markets behaving well. For most people, that danger is real because their risk is concentrated. One income, one asset, one obligation. If something breaks, everything feels it. But at the highest levels of wealth, leverage works differently because risk is never allowed to touch the individual. It's absorbed by structure. The ultra-rich don't sign loans as people. They sign them as entities, trusts, holding companies, investment vehicles, layers that create distance between the asset and the individual behind it. So when a luxury home is financed, it's rarely tied directly to personal identity. The liability lives elsewhere, contained, isolated, controlled. This is the first illusion to disappear. Debt is not the threat, exposure is, and exposure is engineered out of the system. Collateral is diversified. The house is backed by portfolios. Portfolios are backed by businesses. Businesses are backed by cash flow. No single asset carries the full weight. Pressure is spread. Risk is diluted. This is why volatility doesn't trigger panic at the top, because no single event can collapse the structure. Even if markets pull back, even if valuations compress, the system holds. Because the loans are never sized to strain the borrower, they're sized to remain invisible. low loan-to-value ratios, flexible terms, long time horizons. Time becomes the real advantage. When you have time, you don't rush. You don't sell at the bottom. You don't react emotionally. You don't negotiate from weakness. You wait, and waiting is power. Another quiet detail rarely discussed: the ultra-rich never rely on one lender. They maintain relationships across institutions, private banks, family offices, specialty lenders, so leverage is never centralized. No single bank controls the outcome. No single decision can corner them. This decentralization removes leverage risk entirely. And then there's the final layer: insurance. Not basic coverage, but complex structures designed to absorb loss. The home is insured, the entity is insured, the liability is insured. So even in extreme scenarios, the individual remains untouched. This is why leverage at the top feels calm, because it's not aggressive. It's conservative, disguised as scale. What looks bold from the outside is carefully engineered restraint. The ultra-rich don't gamble with debt. They sandbox it. They isolate it. They make sure that if something fails, it fails quietly and far away from them. That is how leverage stops being dangerous and starts becoming invisible. And once risk is removed, the home itself becomes something else entirely. Once risk is removed, the home changes. It's no longer just a place to live. It becomes a financial instrument. To most people, a house is emotional, security, stability, identity. To the ultra-rich, emotion is separated from structure. The home is viewed objectively, as a position, a store of value, a source of leverage, a strategic asset inside a much larger system. That's why luxury homes at the top are rarely held personally. They're owned by entities, trusts, holding companies, special purpose vehicles, each designed to serve a purpose beyond living. The home can be refinanced without disruption. Equity can be extracted quietly and redeployed elsewhere. New investments, business expansions, opportunistic acquisitions, all while the owner continues living inside the asset. From the outside, nothing changes. Inside the balance sheet, everything moves. This is where appreciation becomes strategic. When a luxury home rises in value, it doesn't just increase net worth. It increases borrowing power, which increases flexibility, which increases control. The home begins to fund the lifestyle instead of consuming it. At this level, even location is chosen differently, not just for beauty, but for stability, scarcity, and long-term demand. Cities with constrained supply, neighborhoods protected by zoning, markets insulated by global wealth flows. The house becomes a vault, one that can be unlocked repeatedly without ever being sold. And because it's structured correctly, tax efficiency follows naturally. Interest offsets income, entities manage exposure, timing controls liability. Nothing is rushed, nothing is forced, selling is optional. That's the real advantage. Because when selling is optional, negotiation power shifts completely. Urgency disappears, pressure evaporates, control remains. This is why ultra-luxury homes are rarely flipped. They're held, refinanced, repositioned. Passed through structures, not traded emotionally. At this point, the home isn't real estate anymore. It's infrastructure, quiet, efficient, working in the background. And when a house works for you, instead of the other way around, you're no longer buying luxury. You're engineering it. And this is why the ultra-rich don't just protect wealth, they make it permanent. At the highest levels of wealth, the goal is no longer growth. Growth is assumed. The real objective is permanence, because wealth that lasts for a lifetime is impressive, but wealth that survives generations is power. This is where structure reveals its final advantage. When luxury homes are owned through entities, they don't just protect capital, they protect continuity. Ownership never changes hands emotionally, it transitions quietly. Trusts replace titles, structures replace individuals, So when one generation steps back, nothing breaks. The home remains, the leverage remains, the system remains, no forced sales, no tax panic, no liquidation under pressure. Time does the work instead, because time is the most powerful asset of all. Debt matures, interest is managed, assets continue compounding. The next generation inherits control, not obligation. They don't inherit bills. They inherit options. The home can be lived in leveraged again or quietly restructured for a new era, without disruption, without exposure, without urgency. This is why family offices think in decades, not years. They design systems that can absorb change, market cycles, political shifts, economic stress. The structure bends, but it doesn't break. And because the home was never purchased emotionally, it never needs to be sold emotionally. Selling is a choice, not a necessity. That single distinction preserves dignity, control, and legacy. This is the quiet difference between wealth that fades and wealth that endures. The ultra-rich don't just buy homes. They embed them into systems designed to outlive them. Systems where money never sits still, risk never touches the individual, and control never leaves the family. This is how luxury becomes permanent. Not through excess, but through structure. And now you know why the ultra-rich never talk about how they buy their homes, because once you understand the structure, you stop looking at money the same way. There's a reason the ultra-rich never explain how they buy their homes, not because it's illegal, and not because it's complicated, but because once you understand it, you stop thinking like everyone else. They don't talk about leverage. They don't talk about private banks. They don't talk about structure. They let the results speak instead, because visibility attracts attention and attention invites interference. So the real rules are kept quiet. Rule 1. Cash is never the goal, control is. Rule 2. Ownership is optional. Optionality is not. Rule 3. Debt isn't danger when it's structured. Exposure is. Rule 4. Time beats intelligence every single time. And the final rule. If something looks simple on the surface, it's usually supported by complexity underneath. That's how wealth stays invisible, while power compounds quietly. The ultra-rich don't chase luxury. They engineer systems where luxury is a side effect. And once you see money this way, you don't ask how much something costs anymore. You ask who controls it, how it's structured, and whether it still works while you sleep. If this perspective changed the way you think about money, stay close to CapitalLux. This channel isn't about trends. It's about patterns the wealthy never announce, stories told quietly, strategies built over decades. If you value clarity over noise and structure over hype, subscribe to CapitalLux. New stories arrive here regularly. No alerts, no urgency, just insight for those who notice.